Well, welcome to this panel discussion, which is going to continue our discussions on academic authorship and knowledge production. The fourth speaker on this list, Ola Uduku, in fact can't make it in time for this session. She'll be here this afternoon. So she's actually going to speak in tomorrow afternoon's wrap-up session. And the format of this session here is that each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, and we won't have questions in between the speakers. What we'll do is we'll save up our questions for discussion. And also, if there's any questions that are still coming up from this morning's excellent and thought-provoking session, and I do want to, I haven't forgotten about the issue on open access, because I think we all want to debate open access at some point, because it's such a critical and interesting area. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Stephanie Kitchen, who's the managing editor of the International Africa Institute and managing editor of Africa, to kick off this discussion.
Hello, can you hear me? Is this switched on? Yeah, great. So my role is as the managing editor of various books and journal series published by the International African Institute, a learned society publisher in African Studies, based in London at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. I'm going to talk mostly about the knowledge production part of this discussion, but of course I would observe academic authors are also editors and producers of their own work and the work of others. On this very panel, Insa Nolte is the book reviews editor on our house journal Africa, and she co-writes with fellow Nigerian researchers. Therefore, academic authorship and knowledge production are coterminous and often intrinsically collective endeavours, and both are local and international. Given everything we know about the crises in higher education and consequent impacts on academic publishing in Africa, I would first like to discuss a few positive steps that we and others in African studies have taken to address some barriers to knowledge production between North and South. First, co-publication with publishers in Africa. This is hard, but still possible. Almost every recent title in our major monograph series, called the International African Library, which is published with Cambridge University Press, from whose editor we'll hear later today, on Southern African subjects, has over the last 3 years been co-published in paperback, either by Wits University Press, connected with the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, or by CUP's own Cape Town branch office. Wits very much share our commitment to the widest possible dissemination of knowledge on and from Africa. In practice, such commitment reveals itself in small gestures, such as the foregoing of license payments, raising relatively small grants to reduce production costs and price, and authors being willing to help with local promotion. It's true that these co-publications are with South Africa, which itself has a tiny market for academic books. 300 copies are printed of each of our titles published. Elsewhere, co-publishers are not always found. Another book series we publish, African Arguments, topical paperback and ebooks published in the UK with Z Books, are relatively speaking fairly well distributed in Africa. The books are paperback, hence prices are lower, and books are offered at discounts to bookshops. Distribution deals and licenses with publishers in the continent are sought, and not always found, it must be said. And efforts of formal publishing and distribution still need to be backed up by appropriate book donations to academic institutions and higher education libraries. I would note this is relatively expensive. Co-publication and local distribution should be more efficient. However, my experience is that finding even a single co-publisher willing to take a book on the African continent does not in any meaningful sense equal African distribution. Far from it, as others who are far more qualified than me will discuss later today. I think there are positive signs elsewhere. In journals, for example, INASP, which is interested in the availability of scientific publication in the developing world, has shown that leading journals, and indeed has enabled leading journals to be, by and large, available, at least in theory, freely or at low cost to leading institutional libraries in Africa. Of course, the ideal and realisation of access extends far beyond mere electronic availability, but this is its prerequisite. We can also point to several significant institutionally funded Africanist journals, such as Codesria, which is the social science research institute based in Dakar, widely recognised as a leading institution in social sciences, whose journals are open access, or those published in Germany by Giga, including Africa Spectrum, that are all fully open access. And almost all the leading African studies journals allow green open access for authors to deposit peer-reviewed and revised papers into openly accessible institutional repositories. These positive developments in journals are of course enabled by electronic publishing. I'd note we have a long way to go in books to match these achievements. And in books, the economies are by no means straightforward, and we should be wary of techno-fixes to deeper problems of access. I'd like to say a few things about authorship in African studies. I did a very small survey recently of the highly cited African studies journals to look at sort of ethnicity of authorship and so on. I did conclude that these journals are publishing African authors, be they from the continent or significantly in the so-called diaspora, particularly in US universities. Perhaps not enough, and certainly not enough African women, but some. There's higher representation of ethnically African authors in subjects such as current affairs, development and politics. History and anthropology have weaker showings, and yet the Journal of African History, a leading journal in this field, has perhaps the best record of recruiting African editors, including in recent years Cheikh Babu, Keith Breckenridge and Emmanuel Akinpong. So perhaps this reflects the weakness in history scholarship in the African continent, which Insa will discuss with regard to Nigeria. Similar things can be said for the anthropology discipline. Leslie Bank, a leading anthropologist at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa, suggests useful ways in which institutions such as ours can play in finding collaborative and creative ways to support such disciplines in African institutions. Moving on to editorship, by which I mean academic editorship of journals and book series, commissioning, decision-making, gatekeeping is very important. We are moving towards what I tend to think of as a better but not yet good situation as regards African and female representation in editing journals and book series. Africa, the journal Insa and I work on, now has a Nigerian co-editor called Wale Adebanwi. Efforts are made to add African academics to the editorial board to enable them to build experience. The series editors on our book series, African Arguments, have Alcinda Hanwana, and Leslie Bank at Fort Hare is an editor of our major monograph series. So we are international in that sense. And also note the efforts through the provision of writing workshops organised by Codesria in the African countries and the African Studies Association in the UK to support African scholars from the continent and diaspora to publish. More could be done. I'm speaking personally now. Whilst commissioning books for our African Arguments series, I would say I find it easier to approach an academic from the London School of Economics or Oxford to write a book on a fashionable topic, dare I say, drugs, China in Africa, or perhaps to ask an author from a European institution that supports its staff's publishing endeavours to write on environment or climate change, than to find the means to support a woman of African descent to write for our series on such urgent matters as gender or women's lives. We still don't have a book in our series on this topic. And of course, there are deeper reasons for these kinds of dilemmas. Fatou Sow, a leading African scholar of gender and feminism, wrote rather drastically in an essay in 2007 that in the Francophone African context, and I quote, "There are no university research nor teaching centres that focus solely on women's issues. Rather, it is individual initiatives that are starting to bring questions to the fore. In addition, the frameworks for developing and documenting ideas are painfully inadequate. Academic stimulation barely exists at a local level. This is further compounded by the poor standards of scientific documentation. The difficulty of financing appropriate academic research in African universities do not facilitate an expansion of research, which is undertaken quasi-surreptitiously." So I hope it's clear from what I say that I share in my work, I hope reflects the kind of activist agenda of the organisers of this impressive conference, bringing together representatives from Africa, the Middle East and South Asia. i.e. to improve publishing and knowledge circulation in and with the Global South. What I think is problematic about this agenda is that those who we might identify as being part of the structural obstacles to achieving this, be those the multinational textbook publishers that dominate local African markets, or African governments which disinvest from higher education and research, or indeed northern donors who close appropriate schemes that promote books, publishing and knowledge exchange, or on quite another level, as we heard this morning, with reference to the Arab world, and I think some comparisons can be made easily in the African world, the authoritarian regimes that militate against academic freedom and the availability of research data per se, and one could go on. Now, these people are not likely to be in this room. But I would say that targeted lobbying of policymakers in the north as well as the south continues to be vital, and that practitioners can usefully help identify where we think the barriers lie. So I'd now like to pass on to Insa, who's going to discuss these questions in more detail with reference to her research and collaboration with academics in Nigeria.
Thanks, Stephanie. And Insa Nolte from the Department of African Studies and Anthropology at the University of Birmingham.
Yes, thank you very much for having me here. I'm delighted to be here. I'm an anthropologist and I speak as one today. From the experience of the field, for the past 4 years, I have worked in a joint project with Nigerian colleagues, and I've been a member of staff at Osun State University in Nigeria, as well as my home university in Birmingham. And I've very much enjoyed and learned a lot from being part of the very lively and productive academic community within Nigeria. But I've also become much more aware of the complex political economy that impacts on knowledge production. And just as a footnote here, I should say that I was listening to Professor Chaudhary with both admiration and a little bit of jealousy, because internet access still remains very limited in most parts of Nigeria. So I'm talking mainly here about print production of books and articles. So I'll start, like anthropologists do, with a little vignette. Part of our project was the production of an edited volume on an aspect of our research, which had to be published within the EU, reflecting the funders' interests. A first draft of the book was complete in 2014, then was submitted to a process of internal review in my department, submission, and responding to editors' comments. This actually created some crisis for us, because my mostly Nigerian collaborators were sometimes irritated at the length that everything took. And one of them explained to me that he really did not see the point of slightly rewriting his chapter, not once, not twice, but 3 times. It was in ongoing conversation with my colleagues that I realized that their expectations were based on publishing practices in Nigeria, where many of them have been involved in book publications where the chief editor or an institution pays a publisher, and including a reputable publishers, to produce a number of copies, which are then launched in a wonderful society event where the books are sold by friends and interested well-wishers in order to help the academic to recuperate their expenses. And of course, this is just a case study. It's not based on a survey, because such data does not exist in Nigeria, but apparently this is how many university presses as well function these days in Nigeria. Given the country's large and lively academic sector, the thriving culture of academic book publication in the 1960s and 70s, what had happened? Why had book publishing turned into a project where the primary concern was profit? So I'd like to say a little bit about what happened to universities in the 80s and 90s, and I want to reflect following the example of Professor Hanafi on the politicization of society and state and how that impacts knowledge production, and finally think a little bit about what internationalization has meant for Nigerian publishing. So Nigeria experienced a prolonged period of military rule, especially in the 90s and 80s, which led to an exodus of Nigerian scholars at that period, mainly to the US and also to the UK and other countries, because universities were starved of resources and political recognition, very often also subject to meddling. The politicization of appointments and promotions meant that for an increasing number of scholars, careers depended not on recognition in any way, but on internal patronage. Library budgets were slashed or privatized, and even for those who were genuinely committed to scholarship, this was often a secondary concern because the country's economy tanked, making the writing of books increasingly hard to achieve. Parallel to this decline of the university infrastructure was a process that we could perhaps call the privatization of the social infrastructure. And this affected especially research in the humanities and social sciences. First of all, a very important process was the politicization of demographical and statistical data, which simply ceased to be produced, especially where it might not be aligned with entrenched interests. So, for example, we haven't had any surveys on religious identification, for example, or detailed access to education in Nigeria since the 1960s. As a result of the absence of data, which is self-understood for social scientists in almost all parts of the world, Nigerians were unable to engage with the qualitative revolution that has reformed social science elsewhere and continues to do so, say in the digital humanities. And they have been unable to engage in a serious debate on methodology and the nature of knowledge production in such quantitative contexts, meaning that really the debate continues to be dominated by ideas produced outside of the Nigerian context. As a result of the lack of these sort of surrounding data, social science research, like research in the humanities, relies largely on small-scale case studies and journalism. This, of course, appeals to international audiences only where it engages with already existing debates on Africa, but rarely allows Nigerians to challenge the assumptions that underlie the debate. If they have access to it, I'm very glad that Ola Uduku is coming tomorrow to speak about the state of libraries in the parts of West Africa where she works. But the politicization of public life has also had a crippling effect on historical research. Archives, like libraries, need resources to function as they should. In several archives I have consulted in the past 4 years, colonial files that I saw and partially copied as a PhD student had disappeared, especially where they related to land or chieftaincy titles. Archives on the post-colonial period are virtually non-existent because no politician can afford to make her or himself vulnerable to criticism. I have seen boxes with files in the houses of former local government officials held in order to control and influence others as well as to protect the owner. So there's a very strong political logic for not leaving those resources in a depository anywhere. In fact, one of the few politicians who has set up a library to keep his files has seen all the files disappear. This is the Yoruba politician Obafemi Awolowo. And after his death, all his political associates came to the library, the librarian told me, and carted away the files that were of relevance to them, because they simply couldn't afford for them to fall into the hands of their enemies. As a result, there are, over 55 years after independence, very few local sources available to scholars working on the post-colonial period. The implications for the engagement of Nigerians with historical and historiographical debate are clear. But of course, there are areas where Nigerian scholarship still shines, despite its many limitations. the effervescence of scholarly production in fields like African languages, music, literature, etc. illustrates that many Nigerians have not only the talent, but also the material to write, and also to write books. However, if they do, they don't, on the whole, publish them in Nigeria. And here I come to my last point, namely internationalization. After the prolonged period of military rule, the country returned to civilian rule. I'm reluctant to say democracy, in 1999. And in a very honest attempt to rebuild the university system, which also included a certain commitment, financial commitment, Nigerian universities looked at ways of breaking the stranglehold of patronage. And here it seemed most logical to look at the outside world, at the international academic world. Importantly, especially promotion became dependent in many institutions almost exclusively on international, or as they're called, offshore publications. This is, of course, good in some ways because it allowed very promising scholars really to come out from under the oppressive presence of people who had built their empires on the basis of political connection. But it also had a very important side effect. It devalued existing and excellent Nigerian journals, which were no longer considered reputable, high status, and it fueled the production of fake journals where you pay $100 for the publication of your article, and which are run from international locations, very often in Turkey, but also in Europe and even North America. Moreover, as only the international status mattered, not the form of publication, in many universities, book reviews, scholarly articles, and books counted as the same thing, one international publication. It is perhaps not surprising, then, that most scholars focus both their local and international efforts on textual forms that can be produced relatively quickly. In other words, Nigerian scholars do try and work very hard to publish articles internationally, and many succeed, but publishing books has taken very much a second seat. Many scholars, and of course, I should say this before I move on, and of course, another aspect of the international journal article is, and that's what many colleagues have told me, is that it can be accessed widely, not by Nigerian colleagues, but by Western scholars who may be in control of resources useful for Nigerian scholars, such as fellowships and scholarships, right? So it's actually publication really with a view to the outside. Scholars enterprising and brilliant enough to still write great books, just for the pleasure of it, also tend to publish them internationally, in that very same logic. In this way, local publishers often publish what's left. Edited volumes or book of mostly local interest, including Festschrifts and, of course, also vanity projects. The wonderful thing is that irrespective of this, there are good academic books still published in Nigeria. But unless there is a major shift in the university and wider political landscape, the number is unlikely to increase. We are thus observing a process of an ongoing centralization of academic knowledge production, in which Nigerian academics play a very strange role in that they can produce to debates that are already established, but they are very rarely in a position to actually challenge the underlying parameters of this debate, and in which they become increasingly dependent on often personal and professional relationships with scholars in the global north who can afford them access to the resources they need. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. And our final panellist is Padmini Ray Murray, who stepped in at the very last minute, I want to say, and because Ola couldn't make it yet. So a particular thanks to Padmini for jumping in and helping us at the last minute. Thanks.
Right, thank you. So yes, so my provocation is with a view to looking at what the book means in different cultural contexts. So yes, what is it like to be a book? If a book was capable of being concerned with its own ontology, it would surely be having some sort of deep existential crisis by now. And projects such as the Academic Book of the Future always seem to me as means to rescue this beloved cultural artifact from the throes of deep depression. In my capacity as a book wrangler, read someone who calls herself a book historian and a digital humanist in the same breath, I would hazard that the book is ultimately a container. It may have different affordances, functionalities, and means of interfacing with its user, but its primary function is that as a carrier of content. As the shift to digital became more ubiquitous in the late 1990s, it was no surprise that the new format should inherit the conceptual shape of the printed book. Nowhere was this more evident than in the skeuomorphic design of ebooks with pages, albeit that one had to swipe, not turn, and book covers represented by thumbnail images of the same. This remediated reworking of the authorial manuscript extended far beyond mere reproduction of the text in digital form. As an entirely different format, new rights regimes have had to be constructed to take into account the relative ease of publishing ebooks and their facility to cross territorial boundaries due to their global home, the internet. However, the trajectory of the digital is not uniform, and the experiences and consequences of such in the global south, and India in particular, is noteworthy and what I'll be talking about today. These developments have disrupted the meaning of the book, as we understand it, which had hitherto referred to the codex form of pages between a front and a back cover, and whose definition is now increasingly challenged by its digital incarnations. Its shift from physical to a virtual entity has transformed our understanding of what a book can be, might hold, or even might be like to hold. The ebook mimics the material book in that it is a textual container, but the capabilities and use of digital devices used to access these texts extend far beyond this single purpose. As Claire Squires and I have argued in our reformulation of Robert Darnton's communication circuit, the binder of Darnton's original diagram has now been replaced by the device. And while occupying the same position in relationship to the reader, it also has a relationship, very importantly and significantly, to the technology companies that make these devices, which create walled gardens in order to ensure the loyalty of the reader to both the device and the platform. In India, the triumphal mythic narrative of relatively high and rapid rates of internet penetration is underpinned by the country's access to data via mobile devices, leapfrogging over the stage of the home ownership of the PC. The black box proprietary technology of, say, the iPhone, or the less explicitly restrictive nexus, pun unintended, between the Android OS with the device manufacturers have meant that we have large swathes of technology users whose only encounter in India with online content has been via these closed ecosystems. These are my more general observations on the transitions taking place, but while much of this furnishes a context that is more or less universal, there are definite and unique particularities that distinguish the situation in the global south, and in particular India, from that in, say, the UK and the US. And nowhere is this difference more palpable than in the area of what we know as academic publishing. I'm also speaking tomorrow, so I will be looking at these differences in some depth in that paper. But for now, I'd like to briefly outline what it means to be thinking about knowledge dissemination in a cultural context that's different from the West. One of the obvious outcomes of the growth of digital technology in this region is the increasing intersection with the scholarly record, be that a theorizing of these new contexts, such as in this conference, or in the building of dissemination tools for memory institutions or academic scholarship. As such scholarship, which would be considered under the rubric of what we know as the digital humanities, is still in its early stages in India, it is incumbent upon us working in the field to set an example for other scholars when we build these resources. They should be fast to load, easy to build and administer, which can function in low bandwidth areas. And it's wonderful that this has already been touched upon today, especially as we embark on larger scale projects that are now possible through advances in digitization of different forms of content, as well as of Indic language character sets. And I'd like at this point to just briefly show you a project that I've been working on with colleagues at Columbia called Minimal Computing, which basically seeks to simplify creating web resources so that they are optimized for low bandwidth areas. So, for example, building a website which is a static website, which seems like a throwback to the 90s, but is probably more suitable for the conditions in which we find ourselves in the global south. The most prominent difference, and one which forms the baseline of much of our explorations digitally, is of course in India the multiplicity of language and their regional variations, which means crucially that most of us cannot read the literatures or content produced in neighboring states in their own language, despite the fact that it may contribute to a greater whole that represents Indian knowledge. At this particular juncture in time, when the current government seeks to assert its ideological authority by seeking to silence any party whose idea of India is different from their own, both through formal channels, such as the systematic removal of left-wing historians and thinkers from the Indian Council of Historical Research, as well as through state-sanctioned gagging, such as recent events at Jawaharlal Nehru University, it is more crucial than ever that we as academics speak to each other and create resources that speak to each other as well, in order to use the digital space to uphold and represent democratic values of access to knowledge. You will notice by now that I'm avoiding presenting any material on publishing, or well, at least in the more conventional way in which we understand the industry, because frankly, as Professor Chaudhary has already flagged up, we cannot even begin to have these conversations until we have tools that cater to our local circumstances, both with regards to language and conditions that we struggle with in most parts of India, such as low bandwidth and sporadic electricity supply. I was trustee of Wikimedia in the UK, and when I worked here, I realized that we still had quite a distance to go while working with higher education institutions, because the suspicion of Wikipedia runs deep. But this is even truer in India, which is a shame, because these partnerships are desperately needed to empower academics to create appropriate resources. The incredible work being done by the appositely named Wikipedia Access to Knowledge program that's run out of the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore is striving to create toolkits and resources that might further these aims. And I'll just quickly run through some examples. So they've been looking at languages that are endangered, and there are alarmingly quite a few of these in India currently. So the Tulu language is a relatively less represented language, and there are plans to kind of sustain it through the Tulu Wikipedia. Similarly, they're doing work in Urdu, as well as Santali, which is a tribal language in Bengal. And there's they're trying to put into place an infrastructure around Wikipedia that allows Hindi-speaking Wikipedians to contribute to Wikipedia in fruitful ways. I think the great shame is that publishers are not leading the way in publishing innovation at all. In the UK or elsewhere, I think one of the few examples that I saw when I was working here was Canelo, who really got their hands dirty with technology, but most publishers still seem to shy from actually innovating, not on a workflow basis, but in the actual tech itself. Another example in India of digital innovation is Pratham Books, that has been doing really interesting things with their platforms, but publishers aren't really contributing to this conversation at all, which I think is a crying shame, but it also probably goes to show why academics are finding it difficult to publish academically in a way that everyone has access. I was just at the Internet Researchers Conference, which was the first of its kind that was held in India last week, and I think something that we found was that lots of young scholars are still very descriptive in their approaches to the internet, and I think that one of the solutions might be to actually start creating more digital resources. However, we do have some significant problems. One of the biggest threats to scholarship in Indic languages is a lack of robust metadata schemas, which is due to the still evolving nature of natural language processing in regional languages, which would allow for discoverability and searchability of this sort of content across languages, and thus enhance and grow relationships between the members of scholarly communities all over the country. Another problem that we encounter is the kind of hierarchical nature of search, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, which obviously reinforces certain biases in the kind of way that we access and receive knowledge. And this is even more problematic in that transliteration of Indian languages is not consistent, which means that searchability and discoverability is really difficult. Another kind of feature of how we read and what we read kind of brings me to the fact that we should be looking much more closely to interface. We don't read in the same way all over the world, and the way that we receive and disseminate knowledge differs considerably, even in a globalized world. And it makes more sense to look at local conditions of knowledge production to inform the interfaces that we're hoping to build. To this end, there's this excellent content management system called Mukurtu, which has been built in order to support indigenous communities to manage and share their digital heritage, which takes into account protocols that cultural communities have in order to pay proper respect and weightage to the sort of artifacts that they display and how they display it. So it was built originally in conjunction with communities in Australia, because the Aboriginal communities have very different relationships with technology and what it means to show things via technology according to their own local protocols. And I would say that we need to adopt a similar approach here, in India. I'd like to end with this slightly provocative statement made by Tim Hitchcock. This was in a blog entry on what is the point of the academic book, which is part of this project. In other words, as long as the requirements of authority demand the existence of books to evidence the existence of authors who can be safely given academic jobs, the book, as distinct from long-form writing, has a future. Like neoliberal capitalism, the greengrocer's apostrophe, poverty, and herpes, academic books definitely have a future. I just don't think this is particularly a good thing. And I actually do agree to some extent. What I would like to end by saying is that the concept of the academic book, the kind of humanities, social sciences monograph, that we've come to know as a fixture in the rigmarole of academic promotion and tenure, is not something that we can or we should actually easily import to India, given that we are developing our own resources, and it might make an idea to kind of leapfrog over this stage and move straight to sustainable digital resources that are easily accessible and usable. Thank you.
Thanks, Padmini. Right, well, three very different and provocative perspectives. So, questions, comments, discussion.
Thank you so much about this panel, and specifically I am sensitive to what Professor Nolte said today about the environment in which academics works in universities in the south, like in Nigeria, and the importance of the collaboration with the North as a mean of protection for southern researcher. I am just I'm just scandalized by the position of Italian government vis-a-vis the young Italian researcher assassinated by the security apparatus in Egypt. I mean, because of a financial, because of the economic interest, they want to close the file, although it's a flagrant case. So I think there is a struggle to be done in the northern side to acknowledge the importance of such collaboration between South and North in order to empower the Southern scholars. I mean, this is what I would say.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree, but I also agree that it's a kind of obligation on Northern academics that really needs to be thought through very carefully. I think, for one, it does not make sense for European researchers on Africa to produce their knowledge without really relying on their African colleagues to check and comment on their work, which is still something that is very strong in our discipline. But I think we also need to be aware very much of the kind of research collaboration where the African colleagues basically act as the gatherers of empirical data, and then the European colleagues are the thinkers, because they have engaged with theory. And that is a very unproductive a kind of collaboration which really perpetuates, although it is collaborative, I think it still perpetuates a kind of difference where, Africa produces the empirical material, which is then grist to the mill for theorizing, which is done in a different context. And I, for one, think that it is a very, very important imperative for northern researchers to really go beyond that stereotype. Yeah.
My name is Dr. Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman. I work as an associate fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. A comment and a question. I observe that comments such as I won't call what they had in Nigeria democracy, references to patronage as being something peculiarly Nigerian, and suggestion that even in North America they had fake journals. These struck me as inappropriate on a panel about the academic book in Africa, a panel that has no persons racialized as black upon it. A question. Last year, the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent began here in Britain and around the world, but here in Britain especially, without fanfare and without finance. What should we do collectively in this country and across the so-called diaspora in order to improve the future of academic publishing, whether it be book or not, in Africa?
Yes. All right. Yes. I don't mean to say that patronage exists exclusively in Nigeria. I left my own country, Germany, because I have a problem with authority, and I simply could not fit into the patronage system that governed German universities at the time when I was looking for a job. So there's nothing to say to it. But I think the degree to which patronage became important in Nigerian universities and is actually still in some contexts, it's important to acknowledge this because it is really a serious hindrance for many colleagues who are very talented and could make very much more of their lives if the universities weren't structured like that. And as somebody, as you've perhaps noticed, who's somewhat politically inclined, I think yes, one is torn as an outsider working on a country that isn't one's own, between noticing the difficulties in which colleagues produce knowledge and appearing as a somewhat arrogant outside observer who is little affected by this. I can't change it. That's the positionality in which I find myself in. I've decided to take my colleagues' complaints seriously, but I don't mean to say that Nigeria is, the only country in which such problems exist. What I meant with regard to fake journals is simply that most colleagues I'm aware of publish in those in Turkey. So not that they shouldn't exist elsewhere. I'm quite sure that they exist perhaps even in London. I don't know. I mean, this is just speculation. So.
The United Nations Decade for People of African Descent, 2015 to 2024. It began last year. How can we harness it to achieve the sort of change that you suggested just a moment ago that you can't do alone? How can we collectively achieve some change?
I wish this would be the place to really start thinking about it. I would be very, very interested in, or very delighted to find co-conspirators in a sort of mobilization, because in order to really, to at least commit to the kind of change that's required in the UK, just alone, not even Germany, we're not talking about this, in the UK, I think we really need sort of a large-scale politicization and a rethinking also in university departments with regard to an acknowledgement of the kind of engagement that is needed by people who work, in my case, in Africa with African colleagues, but perhaps more widely in the global south. Because it seems to me, I've said this before, but it seems to be nonsense to be producing knowledge on a part of the world without engaging seriously with researchers who come from there, you know, and who live within the system. So let's speak over coffee and let's discuss. I should perhaps say, I'm not sure if I'm advertising, but I am the vice president of the African Studies Association of the UK, and I'll be president from September, unless there's a revolution. So if there is a way in which colleagues here can think of a way of perhaps using and mobilizing that association, I think that might be a wonderful start, at least, for mobilization in the UK.
My name is Roger van Zwanenberg. I've been involved in small-scale publishing about Africa and other parts of the world for nearly 40 years. And I want to address my question to the first speaker. There are two structural problems that I've encountered of publishing in this country when you are publishing books for or about Africa. The first one is the global multinationals. They are now extremely large, with great resources behind them. There are three in particular. There's Oxford University Press, there's Macmillan, and there's Cambridge University Press, some way behind. And they have resources which make it extremely tough for local publishing to even put their head above water. The second problem is that the differences in the scale of income in all the countries of the global south is such that if you publish a book in Europe, it becomes not viable in a serious way to co-publish that book in the global south. So the Journal of African Studies has a problem which I didn't see the author commenting on. I'd like to have your opinion about that.
Myself. On multinationals, I mean, I agree, you know, I mean, I suppose my role and influence would extend to the, you know, should authors in our fields publish with them? You know, they're caught in their own trajectories of a career promotion and so on. On the scale of resources available to journals in the north versus journal in the south, you know, our journal has, I would say, relatively significant resources, and so do comparable journals. I mean, I think, again, all we can say is kind of collaboration and access, and fairly large steps have been taken to make journals freely available, which, of course, you know, can impact on local economies of publishing in Africa. So that's a double-edged sword. My view is to do it. I don't think we can square the circle in such small enterprises. So we do make journals, and we do donate copies of books. We do make journals online, open access, and so on and so forth. But I know it's not a straightforward discussion.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Dylan Kerrigan, Dr. Dylan Kerrigan. I'm from the University of the West Indies, St Augustine campus in Trinidad and Tobago. firstly, I'd just like to say that all the panelists and the previous panel as well, all the experiences and the overview that you gave of Africa and South Asia and India are similar and very much the same in the Caribbean. We have those exact same problems, the language, the sort of size, all these different problems. And I sort of want to piggyback, because you've all done such a great job of outlaying all the problems. I think we all accept the problems, right? And these things exist, and they're structural, as my colleague here outlined, and historical. And I sort of wanted to piggyback on my colleague in the corner there, who was asking more about political questions. And this also the anthropologist in the middle, Professor Nolte, who suggested something about social movements. I wonder if we could say a little bit more, like what political moves or what social movements, how can we collectivize in ways together in different associations, or using all these vast resources that we have in the Global South. We have huge academic communities in the Global South, even with these problems. How can we, mobilize or use those? What are some ideas that we could really think about academics using the power that they have in a political way to apply pressure in ways that might shift the paradigm as it currently exists? Thanks.
I'm very lucky. I work at a relatively well-to-do university, and I work in a department that includes quite a lot of Africanists, and we are liked by our head of college at the moment. And yet, I find that even in that small context, the mobilization of resources very often depends on presenting a moral argument. I have not yet found the sort of pressure that I can apply within that context. And what the African Studies Association of the UK does, which has, for example, invested quite a lot of volunteer time and its resources in organizing workshops on the African continent with scholars in different locations, helping to bring articles towards publications with editors who are committed to at least supporting an author in a more particular context with the resources they cannot access and through debate and discourse. All of this has relied on the mobilization of volunteer time and very often volunteer resources. So it's been quite difficult. But in the other sense, there are a number of people, or a large number of people, who are ready to do things. I think one of the issues is that very often, I think Northern academics do not really think about that division of labor in collaborations. First of all, I don't think they collaborate often enough. And then I think when they collaborate, they very often do not think about that division of labor between, the empirical guy and the thinking guy. And I think that is something that should perhaps be more problematized and thematized, because I actually think that, reversing this might be incredibly educational. It certainly has been for me. I work with a Nigerian colleague who started out as my junior in terms of professional designation and has now become my boss. So it's been a very, very interesting experience to become at least in part, the empirical person, to familiarize myself with a lot of the problems of fieldwork again, and to engage with a theorizing really from a different starting point. However, again, I was in a privileged position. This is a large research project. Not everybody's doing this. But I do think there are templates and ways of doing this. And I think also simply talking about it is a good start. Now, I wish I had a program now, because I feel I could have, collected some followers. But,
Could I just make a quick comment on the comments? I wonder if this group meeting here these 2 days can actually try to form some tiny little nucleus that gets some change going. I mean, it's very interesting how many people we've got from such in a small group, such very, very different countries, environments, sort of social, political and academic environments. And so maybe we need to kind of see this as the tiniest little nucleus. After all, there is the butterfly effect. Small changes can affect big changes.
Hi, Shaf Tawhid at the Open University. It's a question for Padmini. I hope you don't mind me asking this. It's just I'm obviously amazed by the kind of speed of adoption of digital platforms across South Asia, in terms of the kind of cohort size as well, that you have this population that's now significantly more digitally native than anywhere else in the world, and you have effectively the largest student cohort as well anywhere in the world. And we know from historical precedent that curricular publication often subsidizes academic publication in all sorts of very productive ways. Have you come across any evidence of publishers being innovative in this regard in terms of curricular development with digital platforms, with the what does it feel like to be a book for 21st century Indian kids, for example?
I can't say I have, I'm afraid. I think, and this kind of gestures back to what one of the previous commenters said about the stranglehold of, say, Oxford University Press, etc., which means that smaller monograph presses, say Permanent Black or Yodakin, who have been doing experimentation in their own ways in terms of how they're producing their books for different audiences. So it's an academic book that's still appealing to an interested lay reader. And I think that's a really significant demographic in India, and I'll talk about that a bit more tomorrow. And I think they've been doing really interesting things in that regard. But otherwise, the kind of relationship between curriculum and textbook publishing and the kind of the larger, say, public intellectual, the public sphere, I feel isn't that mutually beneficial. So, yeah.
I had a question for you, Padmini, or rather a point arising out of what you said, but I'll link it to the point made by the last interlocutor, which is that, we mustn't overestimate the influence or the power of this apparently vast and incrementally expanding sort of digital platform, especially the social media, because it still covers a very small section of the Indian population.
Absolutely.
Okay,
yeah.
And effectively, you hear these wonderful stories about sort of great waves of protest and movements being set off by the social media. Invariably, they start in a metropolitan city and are largely confined there.
Yeah.
And that, it cannot keep on growing incrementally much more. It'll hit a ceiling if it hasn't hit it already, but it's close to. But the more interesting point raised by Padmini, and I'm glad you brought it in, because I think this is something we should bear in mind, which is that, when we think of internet access, we think still maybe in terms of the PC or the laptop, but we need to think much more in terms of handheld devices of a much more modest nature. I mean, the biggest democratizing technology that we've certainly seen in India, and I think in many other countries, I was talking to some people from South Africa the other day, they said that happened here, was the sort of mobile phone. Yeah. And although it is still very largely the dumb phone, it is increasingly being replaced by the smartphone. And the smartphone at the humbler end of the technological spectrum, that is likely to be maybe the most effective device, I mean, in a very desultory kind of way as yet. Some of us are talking about how we can maybe spread various kinds of texts through which people can access on very cheap smartphones.
Yeah.
Throughout my part of India. This can happen in other parts of India. And even if they could only read PDF or other files, even if they couldn't kind of interact in the script in question, even that might have a huge spread effect. Yeah. And this, I think, needs to be kept very much in mind in sort of publishing for not just for the academic community, but for the wider global south.
Yes, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think the reason why I particularly chose Wikipedia is that Wikipedia in India and other parts, I think in Africa as well, has a scheme called Wikipedia Zero, which means that you can access it free of cost. Your ISP will not charge you for accessing it. So therefore, I feel that Wikipedia in this sense is kind of cornering the market, so to speak, because they're being able to produce freely available content in Indic languages, which is, again, the other large gap. So yes, absolutely.
That's a very interesting point, actually. When I made my second visit to Sudan 2 years ago, I was told that in the Sudanese population, 5% of people have a bank account and 50% have a mobile phone, which is a fascinating statistic. Final question here, and then I think it's time for lunch.
Well, I come from Uganda, and I taught at Makerere in Dar es Salaam University many years ago. I'm now retired for the last 4 years in Oxford. And as a retiree, I attend many seminars and PhD dissertations and meetings and so on. And I have witnessed a disturbing tendency in Oxford. And I'd like to know what the panelists think might be the cause of that. The general theme is production of knowledge, which all three panelists talked about. I find that, and the specific comments arises from Insa's observation that Africans produce empirical knowledge and Europeans think. Now, I find in Oxford very interesting. I have many examples until I felt that there must be a pattern. I attended, for example, a workshop on conflict and conflict resolution in Africa, PhD dissertation. There must be 30, 40 references, not one single African. Not one. I've written a lot on conflict also, not that my name is my publication important, but not one single African. When I pointed this out, even the PhD supervisor had nothing to say about that. Then another meeting was about ethnic factor in Kenya. And the PhD researcher also embellished the dissertation to Uganda, where I come from, and Tanzania. Again, the same. Not one African author mentioned in the references. I was quite shocked. And I thought it must be exceptionals, but I found it recurring so often that I think it's a pattern. How do you explain this pattern? I'd like to know not only from the panelists, but perhaps from the floor also, whether they have encountered similar experiences in one of the most coveted places like Oxford of educational higher. Why is this happening? I don't understand.
I would say I see similar patterns in the peer review of articles for a major journal. It's difficult to speculate. I think it's probably got something to do with how PhDs are funded in this country and who's being funded to study. And it also connects very much with Insa's point about theory building and who does that and how you have to relate your article to that theory to get past the first post. I mean, I think it's a fair point. Yeah.
Can I say one word about this?
Yeah.
If you allow me. Well, it's absolutely, this is what I called invisible knowledge. When you produce not only in non-English language, but in a local journals, etc. I mean, they are rarely accessible beyond the place of producing it. This is why I insist Cadastria started doing a work, and this need, if there is no database about journals, African journals, there is no way that you make knowledge produced there accessible and visible. This is.
Yeah. It's true. And any of the other panelists want to comment on that, and then we need to finish.
Well, just very quickly. There's a project in American universities at the moment, pioneered by a group called FemTechNet, which we deal with kind of feminism and technology. And there's an actual movement to cite more women. I mean, so because that's another huge gap that you'll find PhD students they're writing kind of PhDs on feminism, and a lot of their the bulk of their references would not be women. So it's not an unusual problem, unfortunately.
Any other comments just on this particular issue, and then we'll finish? Yeah,
I would like to put something very short. I think it partly also reflects the pressures of certainly the UK university system. PhD students have to complete PhDs within 4 years. That means that very long presence in the field becomes very difficult. Now, when you have less empirical material, which you could use as the basis of, your own theorizing, when you have very little of that, then it becomes much easier to write a coherent academic text by engaging with what's already there and trying to fit what you have into a larger pattern, because you don't see what alternative way of thinking about it there would be. I think it also links to a combination of professional and financial pressures within UK academia. My mentors and supervisors all spent between 2 and 10 years working in African universities. Of my generation, I believe so. Oh no, actually, I have one colleague who is currently doing it. So there are very few of us. Why? Because a salary in an African university cannot pay my mortgage. You know? Because once you go to an African university full-time, it is very difficult to come back. So there's been a shift from the 50s and 60s, where it was a badge of honor for any Africanist historian or social scientist to have spent some time in Africa, generally, whatever the country of their specialization, and then maybe a year in Accra, where the intellectual action was really taking place. You know, that just doesn't happen for many people anymore. So I think also there has been a decline of local knowledge among scholars such as myself, because we spend too little time in local contexts, and therefore it becomes easier to just engage with abstract debates which are easy to access.
Yes, my name is Walter Bugoya. I'm a publisher in Tanzania.
So.
It's all very nice, but let's not be too polite and just ignore the fact that there's racism. There is a kind of, what can I call it? Incestuous.
Insouciance?
No, when you marry within your own.
Incestuous?
Incestuous knowledge circulation within these communities that are limited or identify as this school or that school and that school. And I think, I don't think I know that Professor Zeleza has written extensively about this in his book, Manufacturing African Studies and Crisis, in which he deals this exhaustively, because the answer that this is a recent phenomenon is not true. It has been consistent ever since the romance of African studies has been going on. Sorry, I'm not so polite.
No, I think there are different ways, perhaps, in which this has happened. So, I think whereas people say in the 60s and 70s were working very hard to establish that African studies was after all, or studying Africa was after all a legitimate subject, this is no longer a problem. It's been accepted by most people outside or in cognate disciplines. But it's just that what people now find is that the African realities just don't fit the theory, and therefore they must be somehow inferior. So, yes, racism and a sense of superiority, I'm sure, are always there. But I think the way in which it plays out has shifted. As one is addressed, another problem raises its head. So I don't want to say that there hasn't been any progress, but I do think that the way in which universities have developed all over the world has certainly not helped, because under pressure, many people try to fall back on what's easiest.
I think, we've got 2 days to think about these issues, so I really think that I should release you all to have some lunch, but only after thanking our panellists very much for a very provocative discussion.